Hey friends, if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It's one of the most powerful ways you can help the channel grow. Every like, comment, and share that you leave in the first few hours of a video tells YouTube that our stories are worth pushing to a bigger audience. With your support, I know we can get to 25,000 subscribers by Halloween. Remember, we never have ads in the middle of our stories. And don't forget, if you want to rep The Darkest Hour, visit thedarkesthourYT.com for exclusive merch you won't find anywhere else. Thanks for being part of this journey. Now, on with the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Children see the world differently. Where adults explain away shadows and whispers, children notice. They stare longer, listen harder, and sometimes they respond. Maybe it's imagination or innocence. Maybe children are simply closer to that thin line between the living and the dead. Tonight, we'll revisit childhood bedrooms, shadowed playrooms, and hidden corners of memory. Stories of little ones who waved to strangers no one else could see, or who were followed home by things that should have stayed behind. These are the stories that never really leave us. Reminders that the monsters we feared as children may not have been imaginary at all. So, let's get started, shall we? I don't think I've ever told this story in full before, but when I was 5, my family lived in a haunted house in Chicago. And when I say haunted, I don't mean a couple of weird noises or those creaky pipes. I mean the kind of place where every family member, to this day, agrees that something was wrong there. A little history. The house was built in 1928, a big 6-bedroom, 3-bathroom place with tall ceilings and that old Chicago charm. Beautiful on the outside, but there was a darkness in it. I later learned that a man, a father of 2, hung himself in the basement in the 1970s. That was all the official history I could find, but honestly, it explained plenty. My parents were still together back then, before their split, and I was young enough to just accept the house for what it was. But even at 5 years old, I knew something wasn't right. The first clue was the basement door. Every single night, without fail, it would creak open. Not all the way or slamming itself, just a slow, steady creak. Enough to let you know that it wasn't shut anymore. At first, my sister and I tried to ignore it, but after weeks of this happening, we were too scared to sleep in that room. We begged to move, and eventually, my mom turned the basement room into her art studio to solve the problem. For a little while, that worked, until the day I saw the man. My mom was in the art room painting one of her trees. She'd admit herself that they weren't great, and I was sitting on the floor with my Barbies. I remember looking up at the basement door and seeing a man in a suit, just leaning against the frame, staring at her. Being 5, my thought was literally, who's the creepy guy in our house? So I told her. She turned around, saw him, and screamed, a full blood-curdling scream. It scared me more than the man did, because my mom wasn't the type to scare easily. I don't recall using the room after that. Now this next thing is almost embarrassing, but also one of the creepiest parts. My sister and I shared a bedroom by choice, and the entire time we lived there, we both wet the bed every single night. My parents had to put on plastic covers, and it was awful. It wasn't until years later, talking with my sister as adults, that we realized why. I asked her if she remembered how it just stopped when we moved out of the house, and she said, "Yeah, I finally stopped having the nightmare." Turns out we were both having the same kind of dream, every night for years, always a maze, always being chased. It would be a bear, a vampire, different monsters, same endless running, same fear. We'd wake up terrified and, of course, wet the bed. The fact that we both had those reoccurring nightmares and that they both ended the moment we moved, it still gives me chills. Then there was the little upstairs room. It was strange from the start. To get to the attic, you had to go through this tiny wooden room with a child-sized door. It looked like something from a fairy tale, only not the good kind. Naturally, we made it our secret playroom. It felt fun at first, having a hidden spot that no one else used. But the longer we played in there, the weirder it got. Sometimes the whole room would shake, like a train was passing through, even though nothing else in the house moved. Other times our toys would slide around on the floor on their own. And the attic door, it had what felt like 16 locks on it. A regular-sized door, covered top to bottom in bolts, as if someone desperately wanted to keep it closed. Neither of us touched it. Not me, not my sister, not my parents either. It wasn't the scariest thing in the house, but it added to the feeling that the walls were keeping secrets. The last and maybe strangest part of all was Olive. That's what my mom called her anyway. My imaginary friend. But Olive wasn't imaginary to me. She was a little girl, about my age, maybe 4 or 5, blonde hair, green jumper. We'd sit together and color, read books, have tea parties with my dolls. To me, she was as real as any kid on the playground. My mom humored me, probably thinking it was normal childhood stuff. But Olive didn't come with us when we moved. I never talked to her again, never mentioned her again. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. Looking back, I can't shake the feeling that she was tied to that house. We only lived there for about 9 months before leaving. 9 months felt like years to me. Since then, I've kept an eye on the house out of curiosity. It's been sold 13 times in 20 years. At one point, someone even turned it into apartments, only to renovate it back to a single-family home and put it on the market again. When I was 22, I went to an open house just to see it again. The place looked almost exactly the same, except for one detail. The little room upstairs, the one with the tiny door. It had been drywalled over, like it never existed. I was 5 when we lived there, but I do remember it like it was yesterday. The basement door that never stayed shut. The man, the one who scared my mom. The nightmares that haunted both me and my sister. The shaking playroom. And most of all, Olive. I don't pretend to know what was in that house, or why it clung so tightly to my family. But I do know this. We all agree it wasn't normal. And sometimes when I think about Olive and the way she smiled, the way she disappeared the moment we left, I wonder if she's actually still there, sitting in a hidden room behind a wall that isn't supposed to exist, waiting for the next kids to move in. If so, they sure don't stay long. So I hope she's moved on. This story happened about 10 years ago, when my son was 5. It's one of those things I still wrestle with in my mind. Was it just a coincidence, child's imagination, or did we experience something far stranger? That summer, we took a family trip through a few historic sites. My husband is a history buff, and one of our stops was a battlefield, a place tied to one of the bloodiest clashes in our country's history. People say you can still feel the weight of what happened there, and after what we experienced, I believe it. We went on a daytime tour. It wasn't meant to be scary, it was more educational. We walked the trails, saw the old cannons, read the plaques. Our son did what any 5-year-old would do. ran ahead, stopped to play with sticks, asked too many questions. At one point, we were near a slope where the guide explained soldiers had once made a desperate stand. My son crouched down in the grass, poked around, and proudly showed me what looked like a small, rusted piece of metal. I didn't think much of it. It was tiny, about the size of a marble, and half caked with dirt. He insisted it was a treasure. We didn't encourage it, but I also didn't have the heart to tell him to leave it there. I slipped it in his pocket and we went about our day. That night in our hotel, he couldn't sleep. He kept saying someone was talking to him. Not in a scared way, but a matter-of-fact way. The way a kid announces anything. "The man in the boots," he said. "He wants to come home." My husband brushed it off as a dream, but the words kind of made my skin crawl. When we got home a few days later, things started happening. Little things at first. At night, I'd hear what I thought were footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate, too heavy for a child. Sometimes it sounded like pacing. I'd check and find nothing. Our son began waking up crying, saying he couldn't sleep because the man was walking too loud. Other nights he'd sit up smiling and whisper, "He's guarding me." That's when I noticed he was clutching this little piece of metal in his fist. He'd kept it under his pillow. When I tried to take it away, he screamed like I was hurting him. The atmosphere in the house changed. Cold spots appeared, especially near our son's room. Toys moved at night. I put them away, and in the morning they'd be neatly lined up on the wall, like soldiers in formation. Once I came downstairs before dawn, and I found the front door cracked open. My son was asleep in bed. My husband swore he hadn't touched it. I don't know if you've ever lived with that kind of unease, but it's exhausting. You question yourself constantly. Was that sound just the house, or did I misplace that toy? Am I imagining the cold draft? But night after night, the feeling grew heavier and undeniable. The breaking point came one evening when my husband and I were in the kitchen. We both heard it at the same time. Heavy boots coming down the hallway towards us. We froze, staring at each other, neither of us moving. The sound stopped just before the kitchen doorway, but nothing stood there. We didn't speak of it in front of our son, but he must have sensed our fear. He became quieter, more withdrawn. When I asked what the man said, he'd answer with strange phrases that didn't sound like his own. Things like, "Hold the line," or "We won't see the morning." One night I finally broke. I sat on the floor by his bed after he'd fallen asleep, holding the tiny piece of metal. It wasn't just junk. It was like a musket ball, worn and scarred with age. My hands were shaking as I whispered into the dark, "You can't stay here. He's just a child. Please, let go." The next day I told my husband that we had to take it back. He didn't argue. So the following weekend, we drove back to the battlefield. It felt strange, almost ceremonial. We walked back to the same area, and when no one was looking, I knelt down and set the musket ball in the grass. I whispered again. This time I felt a bit choked up. "Rest now. You remembered, but you can't follow us home." That night, for the first time in weeks, our son slept soundly. No footsteps, no whispers. Even the house literally felt lighter. He never mentioned the man in boots again, or the musket ball. None of it. I've carried a strange mix of emotions ever since. Part of me is still shaken. What followed us was not imagination, but another part of me feels grief. Whoever that soldier was, he lingered for so long, maybe just waiting for acknowledgement. My son gave him that in a way, and when I think about it like that, It doesn't feel like a haunting. It feels like a soul that just needed to be seen one last time. But I'll never forget the sound of those boots walking right up to the kitchen door. When I was in 3rd grade, me and my best friend Ricky were out at recess. The perimeter of our playground was surrounded by a chain-link fence. It was as tall as us, but in reality it only went up to the hips of the adults. On the other side of that was a marsh that swampy water pushed right up against the fence. The recess teachers shared a comically large pair of boots that they'd put on to retrieve the frisbees and sports balls that got thrown over. Anything smaller than a baseball or heavier than a tennis ball was considered lost because it was instantly swallowed by the muddy grassland. And the mosquitoes became unbearable the closer it got to summer. I knew my best friend since kindergarten. He was always chill, never got into fights with kids, and he listened in class. Impossible to distract. In retrospect, he most likely was a poster child for the positive effects of Adderall. Whatever it was, I'd never seen Ricky trip out, until the day that Ricky tripped out. He'd brought a toy from home, which was against the rules, but Ricky was too cool to care about the superficial ones. It was his toy, and he accepted the responsibility if anything happened to it. What he brought was a Japanese superhero. It looked like Ultraman, but an insect version of that guy. It had wings and a string that if you pulled it, it would spin the torso so the wings would catch air. It would hover like a helicopter. Ricky's very first demonstration of how it works, a swift rip of the cord leaves the string on Ricky's fingers and lifts the bug hero higher and higher into the sky. Then it began drifting further and further away from us. Anybody could predict exactly where it would go next. Well, anybody except 2 excited 3rd graders, mesmerized at the shiny colors on the propeller wings. Both of us watch as it gently glides over the chain-link fence and into the tall grass. It didn't look like it went too far out there, a few meters from the playground. When it went over, I stayed where I was, and Ricky ran off toward the fence. We knew the teachers out there weren't going to help us. But I wouldn't have guessed that Ricky would have been ballsy enough to hop the fence. After making sure that none of the teachers were paying attention, he climbed over. I was looking around, and so impressed that he got away with it. The kids and the adults alike were none the wiser. Ricky's cool points skyrocketed from that maneuver, and I asked myself, is this what being gay is? It wasn't, but it was the most badass thing I'd ever seen a kid do, and because he was my best friend, it made me the second coolest kid around. My weird fanboy moment was short-lived, however, lasting a couple seconds at most. After Ricky went into the tall grass out of view, the whole playground was alerted by his wailing, top of his lungs shrieks. All of the kids run to the fence, myself included. The recess teachers were close behind asking what's going on back there. Cool kids don't snitch, so I didn't. The sounds that were coming from the tall grass sounded like animals fighting, and a second growling voice started to match the first shrieks. The adults even suggested that that's what it was when they started moving us off the fence. Just animals. I was the only one that knew one of the voices was actually Ricky's, until he made one gargling last shout that clearly said, "Help." Hearing that it was a child on the other side, one of the younger teachers runs and hurdles the fence toward the noise. Then she starts screaming for one of the other teachers to call an ambulance. When she emerges from the grass, her clothes are covered in the sticky muck, and Ricky's in her arms, his body's hanging limp. She hands him to the teacher that didn't run for the phones, and they start performing CPR on him. When the first teacher gets back over the fence, she tells all of the kids to go to their classrooms, and I'm forced to join the group of classmates as they herd us like cattle back into the building. Our class watched the ambulance and police cars pull into the school parking lot. Our classroom didn't face the playground, so I wasn't able to find out what was going on with Ricky until the weekend. My mom drove me over to drop off the worksheets from the remaining days he missed that week. He was in his room, and it was the first time I'd seen him since he was dead on the playground. Ricky always had relatively long surfer hair, but when I showed up, he'd shaved it all off. He also had stitches in a moon shape on the top of his head. When I asked what happened, he made me promise not to tell anyone, and I did. But when he told me, it really freaked me out, and I believed him because he was my best friend and wouldn't make something like this up. The future crescent scar on his head would also add to the validity of his story. So what Ricky told me was that after he got over the fence, he stepped into the tall grass, and his shoes quickly sank into the mud as he tried to keep them from falling off of his feet. I think Ricky might be the first kid to ever see what was on the other side of that fence. He says that on the other side of the grass is an open wetland with a highway barely visible in the distance. He could see his toy stuck in the mud, but it was still pretty far away from him. So he slowly starts drudging through the mud towards it. But from behind another tall patch of grass that was even closer to the stuck toy, Ricky sees an old lady step out of the clearing. I asked what she was doing out there, but he said he didn't know. He was happy to see her, though. He asked her to throw him the spinner while thanking her a bunch as she made her way over to the toy. When she picked it up out of the mud, she held it out to Ricky, and again, he asks her to throw it. But she doesn't. She keeps it held in front of her, just staring back at him. Ricky was too polite to ask again, and instead began struggling in the mud to get over to her. She was maybe 3 or 4 meters away. He described her as a small, elderly woman, a long blue dress that hung off her bony, hunched back, and she had her hair tucked under a bandana. Ricky says that he had to use his arms to pull his legs out each time that he stepped. But after his first couple of steps forward, the marsh got deeper, and Ricky's legs sunk to the middle of his shins, making any progress nearly impossible. As he's trying to jiggle his legs free, he looks up at the old woman and sees her running at him in a full sprint, like the mud was less of an obstacle than her age. Telling me this part, Ricky starts pumping his arms as he described how fast she was coming at him, saying that she closed those meters in less than a couple of seconds. Ricky only had time to scream before the old woman was attacking him with incredible strength, trying to drown him in the mud. She yanked him around with so much force that she was actually pulling out chunks of his hair and scalp. The last breath that he had was used to scream. Then he says the woman was able to fully submerge his head. I asked why he didn't want to tell anyone, and he says he already tried, and it was just easier to say that he fell and continued sinking like quicksand, and parts of his hair also got stuck and were torn out on their own in the 20 centimeters of mud. That bland excuse seemed highly unlikely, but the true story sounded even more unlikely in comparison. Ricky always kept his hair short after that, partially because parts of his hair never regrew in a few baseball-size areas, and he had a bald pride phase in high school, where he thought he was the lead singer of Disturbed. But that's about it, though. We're all adults now. It's been a few decades since the incident, but I like to remind him of the secret he confided in me all of those years ago, and every so often I'll send him a text that says, "Remember when that old lady beat your ass to death?" You know, to show solidarity that I always believed he was telling the truth. Friendship is nice. Pick up your phone and text your best friend something offensive to show them you love them. The end. When I was about 7 years old, my family rented a cabin for a summer trip. It was one of those places that looks cute in pictures. Lake nearby, lots of trees. But when you actually step inside, It smells like damp wood and feels like the house itself is tired of standing there. Even as a kid, I thought something about it was off. I don't usually share this story because it sounds like the kind of thing a kid would make up, but I was there and I lived with what followed. The first night at the cabin, I woke up to find someone standing at the foot of my bed. At least, that's what it looked like. He was tall, too tall to be my dad, thin in a way that made him seem stretched and completely blacked out like a shadow peeled off the wall. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. After what felt like forever, I pulled the blanket over my head and just waited. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, because the next thing I remember is morning light. I told myself it was a dream. Kids have nightmares, right? New places. Except the next night, there he was again. And the next, always in the room, always watching. When the trip ended, I thought I was done with him. But when we got back home, I realized he hadn't stayed at the cabin. The first week back, everything was fine. Then one night, I woke up and saw him standing in the corner by my closet. Same height, same shape, same stillness. It wasn't the kind of thing you mistake for a pile of clothes or a shadow from headlights outside. I knew the difference, even at 7 years old. I never told my parents, partly because I thought they wouldn't believe me, and partly because I didn't want to make it worse. Some instinct told me that saying it out loud would give him more power, make him more permanent. So I kept quiet. But I saw him, night after night. Sometimes he'd be near the closet, sometimes by the door, sometimes at the foot of the bed again. He never spoke or moved once I saw him, but the weight of his presence was enough. It wasn't just seeing him. I could feel him there, even with my eyes closed, like the air was thicker where he stood. I'd lie awake listening to my own breathing and swear I heard another pattern under it. A slower inhale, a heavier exhale. It was the sound of someone else in the room. After a while, I got used to him. I was still scared, of course, but he became part of my nightly routine. Brush my teeth, climb into bed, fall asleep knowing the shadow man would be there when I woke up at 2 a.m. It sounds insane now, but I adjusted. And then just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. There wasn't a final night or a goodbye. One day I just realized I hadn't seen him in a while. I kept waiting, kept bracing myself to open my eyes and find him in the corner. But he never came back. I don't know what he was or why he followed me home from that cabin. I don't know why he stayed so long or why he left. All I know is for years, he was real to me. He was there. Even now as an adult, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and catch myself staring into the corners of my room, half expecting to see that tall shadow figure, standing silently. 'Cause if he could follow me home once, I guess what's stopping him from doing it again? When I was a kid, the scariest place I ever spent the night wasn't out in the woods or at a camp or anywhere you'd expect. It was at my best friend's house. I still can't fully explain why that place felt the way that it did, but anyone who'd ever spent time there knew that it was creepy. Even in the broad daylight, the house felt strange. The air was heavy, and I know you hear that, but it really was. You could feel the difference when you'd walk outside. Their living room was dim no matter how many lamps were turned on. The basement smelled like wet stone, and the upstairs always seemed a little colder than the rest of the house. You never wanted to be alone there, if you were the last one awake, or had to walk down the hall by yourself at night. The feeling of being watched clung to you until you practically ran back to wherever the other kids were. despite that, we had sleepovers there all the time. Her parents were cool, and it was one house where we could eat junk food, stay up late, and blast music without anyone caring. But that odd atmosphere, making the dog bark at empty corners or stare up the stairs whining, it was always there in the background. One night when we were maybe 10 or 11, her older sister decided to mess with us. She'd been talking about mirror games that she'd heard about from a friend. I already knew about Bloody Mary. Every kid did. But this version was different. According to her, if you sat in front of a mirror with a candle and stared long enough, you wouldn't summon a ghost. Instead, your reflection would start to move on its own. She said it was called the other you. Of course, we were curious enough to try. So we crammed into the upstairs bathroom, me, my best friend, and her sister. The room was small, just big enough for the three of us. We turned off the lights, lit a single candle, and placed it on the counter. Its glow flickered across the mirror, making the whole place look like it was breathing. At first, it really was silly. We stared at our reflections and tried not to laugh. We whispered dumb jokes, nudged each other, anything to kill the tension or the boredom. But the longer we stood there, the quieter we got. The flame was steady now, and the shadows in the corner of the room seemed darker somehow. Then I noticed my reflection. It wasn't perfectly in sync anymore. When I tilted my head, it hesitated, almost like it was waiting for me to move first. When I blinked, it didn't blink with me. My stomach dropped. I thought maybe the candlelight was messing with me, but then my reflection sort of grinned. I know I wasn't grinning. My best friend gasped at the same time and clutched my arm. Her reflection was smiling too, according to her. Her sister laughed at us, swore we were imagining it, but when she leaned closer to the mirror to prove us wrong, the candle went out. Just like that. 1 second it was flickering, and the next it was gone. The bathroom went pitch black, and we all screamed. We clawed at the door, tripped over each other to get out. When the light flipped on, the mirror was normal again. Our faces, pale and wide-eyed, stared back at us like nothing had happened. Just our normal reflections. We tried to laugh it off, but that night I couldn't sleep. Lying in her room, I kept staring at the dresser mirror across from her bed. In the dark, it looked like a doorway. I kept imagining someone standing in it, watching us. I finally turned over, but every creak of the house made my heart start to pound. At some point, I guess I drifted off to sleep, but I woke up to whispering. It wasn't loud, more like the rustling of someone speaking against glass. I turned my head just enough to look at the mirror, and I swear I saw movement. Not us, not our sleeping bodies, but something else shifting in the reflection. I buried myself under a blanket and I prayed until the actual morning. When the sun finally came through the blinds, I felt this weird relief until I noticed the candle we'd been using the night before. It was sitting on the dresser next to the mirror. None of us had put it there. I didn't say anything. Neither did my friend. But weeks later, she admitted something that made my blood run cold. She said that she kept having nightmares after that night. In them, she'd wake up and realize that she wasn't in her bed. She was inside the mirror, watching herself sleep. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Just stood there while her reflection, the one in her bed, smiled at her. I remember her mom eventually took the mirror out of her room. After that, she said her nightmares stopped. I never told her this, but I had dreams too. Not every night, not even every week, but when I would spend the night there, I'd wake up certain that I'd been staring at myself from the other side of the glass. And when I looked in any mirror the next morning, I always had to check, just for a second, that the reflection was really me. Even now as an adult, I avoid mirrors in the dark. I know it sounds childish, I know. But I can't unsee that grin, that reflection. It's ingrained in my brain forever. This happened back when I was in elementary school, maybe 3rd or 4th grade. Our schoolyard was basically a big open lot with a blacktop and some faded basketball hoops, and then a huge stretch of grass that sloped down toward a row of trees. Beyond the trees was nothing but fields. To us kids, it seemed endless. We'd dare each other to run down there during recess, even though the teachers always yelled at us to stay close to the building. It was one of those cold, sunny days in early spring. The ground was still a little frozen, the air sharp. The sun felt like it was pretending to be warm, but it wasn't. Most kids were on the blacktop playing kickball, but I got bored, wandered toward the grassy part. A couple friends followed me, but they stopped halfway down the hill. I kept going. At the edge of the tree line, I saw something. Someone standing there. At first I thought it was one of the older kids who'd snuck away to smoke or something. But this figure wasn't moving. It was standing perfectly still. And the weirdest thing was that it didn't look solid. It was like a shadow that had stepped out of the trees. Dark, human-shaped, but not solid. Its proportions were strange, stretched in some places. My brain was doing the kid thing where you try to make sense of something by telling yourself it's normal. Maybe it was a teacher. Maybe a coat rack left outside. But then it moved. Slowly. It lifted its arm and waved at me. Not a playful wave like, "Hi, come over here." It was this stiff movement, like a signal. I backed up a few steps and then turned and bolted toward the blacktop. My friends started laughing at me, asking what I saw. But when I pointed back at the trees, the figure was gone. "Didn't you see it?" They hadn't. One of the recess aides had been watching me. I remember she came over after the bell rang. Her face was pale. She asked me what I was looking at down there. I was embarrassed and just shrugged. She didn't push, but I saw her whispering to another teacher as we lined up to go back inside, and I thought that was strange. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way it waved, the stiffness, the fact that it was gone when I looked back and that no one had seen it. The next day, I tried to avoid going near the grassy part, but I couldn't help sneaking glances at the trees. About a week later, I overheard 2 teachers talking in the hallway. They didn't see me, but I caught enough to piece something together. One of them said something like, "It's that same spot again." And the other said, "Oh, let's not scare the kids. It's been years since it happened." Years since what happened? Eventually, I did some digging, and it would be years later when I was in high school. I asked around and found out that a student really had gone missing from the field in the late 80s, long before I was enrolled. Supposedly, a little boy had been playing near the tree line during recess, and when the bell rang, he never came back. Search parties looked for weeks, but found nothing. The official explanation was that he ran away, but anyone who grew up in that town knew better. Kids whispered about it, parents changed the subject. And now, every time I think back to that day in the schoolyard, I can't shake the feeling that the thing I saw, the shadow waving at me, was connected. Like it was waiting for someone to see it. But I also wonder, had someone seen it before? Is that what the teachers were whispering about. I unlocked my first repressed memory a few weeks ago. At 24, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. When did your first repressed memory surface like a stinking, bloated carcass hooked on a fishing pole? I was absolutely distraught for about 3 minutes. That doesn't seem like a long time in the grand scheme of a day, but spending 3 minutes crying and yelling at a computer monitor, "No, you're not real," wears out your voice real quick. Let me explain, because I wasn't yelling at the computer monitor itself, but to say that I was yelling at a frozen image paused on a YouTube video I was watching doesn't make it sound any more understandable. I was in disbelief at what I was seeing. It was a blue shell to my easy riding night. It halted me right there in my chair. Like, years and years ago, my parents sent me to a psychologist after I told them about what I'd seen. But when I'd seen it most recently, I was watching a series on YouTube. It's a channel called Nuke's Top 5, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. The channel shows viewer-submitted paranormal videos. I was watching the most recent upload, and one of the videos was from a security camera in a clothing store. The views focused on a guy moving around some clothes on a rack. It looks like he's about to steal some stuff, and that's why they originally captured the footage. But the camera also caught something small peek out from behind his leg. It's probably a foot tall. The man didn't know it was there. It looked like a well-dressed troll. I knew exactly what it was when I saw it. Well, not what it was, but I knew exactly what it was doing, hiding behind the man's leg. Basically, it was, let's say, inspiring the man to shoplift, hijacking his free will. The reason I'm certain of this is because I'd seen a fancy-dressed troll of the same species. But the circumstances in which I saw him were apparently so traumatizing that I blocked it all out. Again, I remember going to a psychologist, therapist, and a school counselor regularly for about a year because of all of this. And before my personal memory got dug up, I did vaguely remember talking to doctors, but I could never really recall the reasons why I was there. That was until I saw the video, and it all came back to me. When I was 7, my mom had given me a few dollars so I could walk to the gas station and get myself a popsicle. A new shiny Arco station had been built less than a mile away, and it had an oddly abundant variety of frozen treats. The trip I'd been sent on was nothing out of the ordinary. I got to the gas station and grabbed a SpongeBob popsicle. Even a minuscule detail like that, I remembered because of what happened next. There was a line of people at the register, and after standing in front of the open freezer door, enjoying its cool breeze, I got in line behind a guy in a Hawaiian print shirt. The pastel colors made the sweat spot on his neck look like part of the design. It was him and one other person in front of him checking out, and I was getting nervous my popsicle was going to melt before I could enjoy it. Standing there in line, I decided to open the wrapper and started snacking on it while I still could. I had the money to pay for it, and I kept my spot in line, so I didn't think the clerk would care, and it would have been the least of his problems that day. Because as I'm standing in line, I pop one of the gumball eyes off and start chewing on it as the doors behind me slide open. Another customer had come in and began walking up and down the aisles. He was wearing an orange Denver Broncos hat, pulled low to hide his eyes. And at first I thought he had a pet iguana or some kind of lizard pet crawling on him. But it was wearing clothes, like a blue coat, brown pants, people clothes. It looked like one of those little monkeys all dressed up, but when I really looked at what it was, I realized I'd never seen an animal quite like this one. It was more human than ape, but more troll than human. The man that it was crawling on was sweating and continuously looking over his shoulder back at the register. His body didn't move from the weight of the creature either. It spider crawled around his body, and the guy acted unaware. It would sit on his shoulder for a few seconds, then do a figure 8 around his body before returning to its gargoyle-looking pose on the man's shoulder. In front of me, the transaction completes, and the till on the cash register opens for the attendant to give the woman her change. Within an instant, the man wearing the Broncos hat has put himself in between the woman and the counter, and he's pointing a sawed-off shotgun right in the attendant's face. Hawaiian shirt guy was not going to be the hero. He shoves past me to run out the door, and I watched in a full, unobstructed view as the man with the shotgun pulls the trigger before the gas station attendant can raise his arms. It was a deafening explosion that made my ears ring, like a firework of yellow and red had gone off a few feet in front of me. Covered in the man's blood, the shooter leans over and clears out the register, stuffing a fistful of cash into his pockets with one hand and still holding the shotgun with the other. The woman he'd stepped in front of had collapsed to the ground. She was screaming, no words, just screaming, as she tried to wipe the blood off of her skin. I, too, had been dusted by a light mist of the attendant's blood and brain matter. The SpongeBob popsicle in my hand also gets showered in the dark liquid. The attendant's shirt had gotten snagged on the cigarette rack, so instead of falling to the floor behind the counter, his body's held up like a scarecrow, and I'm able to see what a sawed-off can do at point-blank range. The troll sitting on the man's shoulder laughed with morbidly human emotion. Not only was it enjoying the heinous situation playing out, I think it could have been orchestrating it as well. When the register was empty, the man runs past me. His eyes stayed fixed on the exit, and he doesn't look my way. But the troll on his shoulder did. Small, yellow, and black eyes. I can recall that in the fraction of time of our eyes meeting, it felt like time slowed down. As the man barrels out of the gas station, it was as if he was walking, and I could frame the moment the troll glanced back at me. His eyebrows raised and his laugh stopped. Then they were gone. The lady was still screaming. She was probably already on her cell phone talking to the police after that. I think I set the popsicle on the counter and went home. I'm sure the cars that drove past must have thought that I looked absolutely insane on the walk. Nobody stopped, though, because I do remember getting to our front porch, and I was by myself when my mom saw me outside, all covered in goop. For months, the man with the Broncos hat chased me in my dreams. Sometimes he'd be joined by the headless attendant. What I witnessed impacted me far beyond my consciousness. My sleeping habits were all out of sorts. If I wasn't feeling natural insomnia, the images of gore that flashed through my mind would keep me awake. I was obsessed with the troll. I told everyone I could. I didn't know what I saw wasn't normal, and eventually the team of doctors I was meeting with convinced me that my brain had created this creature. Also, I could better process the shock of the tragic violence that had taken place in front of me, and I guess all the medications they put me on helped me to block it out. 17 years later, I watch a YouTube video, and the mental dam those doctors work so hard to build falls to pieces. Again, I called my mom after seeing the video. I'm 24 and was in full hysterics when she answered. I heard her say to my dad, "She's talking about the troll again," and my dad whispered something like, "Oh no." Before they offered to come over to my apartment until I settled down, I showed them the video clip, and neither of them gave it any credit. They gave it every excuse in the book as to what it was, reinforcing there's no such thing. I'm sure that's what they were trained to do, and wouldn't give me a straight opinion either way. If something like this sounds familiar in any way, please contact me. This is not a creepypasta or whatever, and I would love to know if others have seen this. I've carried this story with me for years, and though I don't usually post things like this, I feel compelled to write it down. Not as a ghost story meant to scare everyone, but as a kind of remembrance. When my daughter was 5, we moved into a small neighborhood. Every yard had a swing set or a garden patch, and you waved at your neighbors while bringing in groceries. Our home was simple and cozy, with a backyard where my daughter loved to play. Next door sat a house much like ours, except it had a small basement window just above ground level. They looked out into the side yard, shadowed most of the day. I hadn't really noticed them before, at least not until my daughter started waving at them. It began casually. She'd be chasing bubbles or riding her scooter, and then stop and wave toward the basement windows of the neighboring house. At first I thought she was pretending or maybe saw her own reflection, but she did it with such purpose, such familiarity, that it made me pause. One afternoon, I asked who she was waving at. Without hesitation, she answered, "The woman with the pretty eyes." From then on, it was constant. Almost every time we were outside, she'd acknowledge this unseen woman. If I asked for more details, her answers stayed consistent. "She has really pretty blue eyes," she'd say. Or, "She smiles big like Fifi." Fifi is my niece, my daughter's cousin, and she does have that unmistakable, wide smile that lights up her whole face. To hear my daughter make that comparison between someone she loved dearly and this mysterious woman, it was both comforting and unsettling. I looked for myself more than a few times, more than I can count. I'd squint at the windows, lean to catch a glimpse, but there was never anyone there. No movement, no flash of color, nothing. Just still glass. And yet my daughter was unwavering. She'd wave, sometimes even giggle as though the woman had waved first. My husband and I didn't discourage her. We've always believed that children perceive things that adults no longer can, and she wasn't scared. If anything, she seemed to find joy in this invisible friend. So we let it be. We kept our unease to ourselves and instead allowed her to tell us about this woman with the pretty eyes whenever she wanted. Months passed and it became part of our routine. My daughter waving at the windows wasn't strange anymore. It was simply something she did. It wasn't until nearly a year later that the story behind it all finally surfaced. It was a Saturday morning. I was chatting with another neighbor over coffee. We talked about the usual neighborhood things, school events that'll be coming up, gardens, the weather. At some point, I laughed and casually mentioned how my daughter had this funny habit of waving at the basement windows next door. I told her, "She says there's a pretty-eyed girl over there who smiles like her cousin." I'll never forget the way my neighbor's face changed. The warmth draining, and she went quiet for a long moment. Then carefully she asked me, "Has anyone ever told you about that house?" And that's when she shared what she knew. 6 years before we'd moved in, the homeowner discovered a woman's body in the basement of that very house. The details were tragic. Out of respect and privacy, I won't use names or locations, but the case had gotten some attention. A young woman had been taken from this world, violently, hidden away in a place that no one should ever have to die. I went home, shaken. That night, after putting my daughter to bed, I sat at my computer and began to search. It didn't take long to find old articles, the archived reports, even a news clip or two, and when I saw her picture for the first time, I froze. There she was, a young woman with bright blue eyes, long brown hair, and a smile that lit up her whole face, wide and warm, just the way my daughter had described it, exactly the way she said, "She smiles big like Fifi." I sat there crying, crying for a woman I'd never met, whose life had been cut short so cruelly, and yet who my little girl had somehow recognized across the years. From then on, I couldn't help but feel connected to her. I whispered to her at night, telling her I was sorry for what she endured, that she wasn't forgotten, that I hoped she'd felt seen and loved. My daughter eventually stopped waving as she got older, but I never stopped thinking of the woman in the basement. One day, years ago, my husband and I found out where she was buried. We went, brought flowers, stood at her grave, and prayed. And in that moment, I realized that my daughter, she hadn't seen a ghost in the frightening sense. She'd seen a person, someone who, in her innocence, she'd recognized not for her tragedy, but for her beauty, for her eyes, her hair, her smile, for the warmth that she must have carried in life. That's how I choose to remember her, too. I still think of her often, and whenever I see my daughter laughing with her whole face, I think of that woman's picture, her bright blue eyes, and how even in death she was not invisible. She was remembered, loved, given flowers. I think sometimes what lingers isn't meant to frighten us. Sometimes it's just someone hoping to be seen again. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me, whether it's your first time or you're a regular. Your support means the world over here. We've got brand new episodes every Friday, and keep those eyes open for those deep sleep videos. Of course, subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Special thanks to the Darkest Hour channel members: Lori TESDAHL, Sarah Marie, Robert Bailey, T. COLTDADDY Eagle, MALLORY Dominguez, KARI WATKINS, PILAR TREDEN WIXSON, Larry Hill, RIPLEY, JOJO STARCHER, Mary Patrick, Debbie LAFRENIERE, Julie Bourdelais, Jennifer BECK, MARINA LACHNER, Make Hamilton Home, Evan Pratt, Mary Hineline, Katharine Yes.ImtherealKatie Isabelle, Landshark, Danielle Hecht, Mama P, Keziah Pietersen, Amber Baker, Khris Lauzon, Kara Geos, Marvin Allen, Forgotten Ruins TV, Raven Wolf, Carlos, Stacia Gillette, Nate Black, Jill Harper, Kathy Balkenbush, Cosmic Chick, Sierra Guerrero, Deanna Kuzman. And big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of our patrons: Tracy S., Mary H., Tanya F., Tamara K., Monica L., Zoe Watt, Shelley B., Donald C., Marion T., Rat Girl, Alicia S., Aaron G., Nikki H., Mr. Revenant, Naz K., Brendan G., Paul T., Nicholas C., Tony P., Lizanne, Arlene F., Adrian, T.F. Parham, Jason G., Lori T., and Bobo Jenkins. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider becoming a channel member or joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, Amanda, darkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.